Well, the title this week is called Consistent Building. Be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind. And that's from Romans chapter 12, verse 2. And this is Paul's admonition. Many people understand this in principle, but they fail to demonstrate because they do not carry it out logically in practice. During prayer, they carefully build up the new mental structure. But as soon as their time of prayer is over, instead of faithfully preserving that structure intact, they promptly knock it down again by negative thinking. Obviously, a bricklayer could work hard in this fashion year after year without ever accomplishing anything. If you are failing to demonstrate, it is probably due to the same cause, building followed by wrecking. We are transformed by the renewing of our minds.
Thank you. We're going to talk a bit about renewing our minds, but in a different way. Where I want to start with a poem. There was an article I read by an emergency room physician and how they dealt with death. And I want to expand from it. But this physician said that when they lose a patient, the staff gets together and someone reads this poem to remind them the reference point, the perspective. This is by Mary Oliver, whom I do not know. Oh, you do? You know anything about her? Do you want to share?
Just you share.
Okay.
Yeah,
so this is the poem. You must be able to do three things: to love what is mortal, to hold it against your bones, knowing your own life depends on it, and when the time comes to let go, to let it go. Now, at first glance, and probably as she wrote it, we're dealing with life and death here. If you recall, the last or second last talk I did was in the real world. I want to take a look at this poem, if you will, as reference to the real world. Hence the title, Rowing Your Boat While It Is Still Tied to the Pier. About the time I came across this, I've heard in an NPR interview a reference to Einstein, sort of a complaint, if you will, that humankind has the illusion that time is an arrow. And where he was headed was that time is multi-phase, multi-shaped, multi-purpose, if you will. That there's not a beginning and an end or a straight line railway passage of time. And then about the same time, I also heard a discussion where they talked about Buddha's death and the fact that he had proclaimed he would not die until he was assured that everyone had achieved nirvana. So how do you explain his death? And the way the Buddhists do, or at least the Buddhists that this was referred to, that when he could see across all time that ultimately every denizen of this earth had achieved nirvana. So he wasn't talking about this one point in time where he was dwelling, but everywhere he could see. Then he felt free to leave this earth because everyone would have achieved, would thus achieve nirvana. and thus his job was completed. So tie into all this the idea that this is not the real world, that this that we can touch, that we can see, that we can feel is not the real world. Richard Rohr, for those who may be new here, I quote Richard Rohr a lot, Franciscan priest, spiritual author, leads the Center for Action and Contemplation in New Mexico. And honestly, his beliefs mirror ours or parallel ours way more than it parallels Catholicism. He writes about physics and trying to understand our spiritual being. Specifically, he's talking about quantum entanglement. Any of you who frequent holistic shows or holistic expos, you'll find lots of healers who claim they're doing quantum healing or using quantum physics to do healing. Jury's open on that. But here he talks about one specific element of quantum physics. It is now demonstrated that two particles distant from each other to extremely distant from each other, if something happens to this particle, the other one also experiences it. And the way he calls it, in an entangled pair, one particle knows what is happening to the other particle. Does that remind you a little bit of shamanic work or psychic readings, perhaps? So he talks about scientists don't know how far or how much of this happens beyond the very rare particles that they've been able to test. But, he says, entanglement hints at a universe where everything is in relationship, in communion, and also where such communion can be resisted, which he calls sin. And he says there's both positive and negative entanglement in the universe. There's prayer, intercession, healing, love, hate, heaven and hell. But now they're all intertwined. He makes the point that religion has long pointed to this entanglement, even though it had nothing to do with physics. In Romans, Paul says the life and death of each of us has influence on others. And in the Apostles' Creed, there's the statement that we believe in the communion of saints. In other words, the interconnection among all of us. And understand that when I say all of us, I'm not just talking about Homo sapiens, but I'm talking about this whole big round ball that we inhabit. Everything here is interrelated. Another philosopher wrote, someone named Judy Canaro, a name I do not know. Emergent theories seem to confirm what mystics have been telling us all along, that we are one, not just all human beings, but all creation, the entire universe. And I will add, the entire set of universes and existences. She goes on, as much as we may imagine and act to the contrary, human beings are not the center of the universe, even though we are a vital part of it. Nor are we completely separate from others, but live only in and through a complex set of relationships we hardly notice. Interdependent and mutual connections are integral to all life, she writes. Now, I want to talk a bit about that interconnectedness. those of you who are familiar with Lifton therapy or have experienced it will not be surprised that we have witnessed when a parent heals, it is often passed on to the child. When a child heals, it is often passed back to the parent. And Lori has occasionally testified to that in previous sessions here. Richard Rohr, coming to him again, talks about his discovery that you can pray for the present, you can pray for the future, but you can also pray for the past. Well, think of Einstein. It's not an arrow, it's an all-encompassing, multidimensional existence. And we can reach through all pieces. Think of shaman. Lori recently invited all of us at that meeting or that session to attend a meeting at her church, Zoom-wise, with a Finnish-trained shaman who does spiritual healing or spiritual surgery, and he has effectively healed several things for Lori herself. It's outside our bounds, our understanding of time and place. The idea of shamanic animals who serve us if we call on them is outside our framework of time and space. Sister Pepper used to talk. Sister Pepper, for those of you who are new, was my bishop, founded the church that Revelation Spiritual Church is the descendant from. And she'd make the point every so often, you know how Jesus would appear to people after he'd been crucified? She'd make the point, that wasn't his physical self. That was his spiritual self appearing as if physical. What we are dealing with, what we need to deal with in our spiritual walk, is the willingness to understand that this is the movie, to quote the late Alan Ramsey, and everything else is the reality. Which leads us to the original quote, rowing your boat while still tied to the dock. As long as we're still trying to tie ourselves, limit ourselves to this movie, which metaphorically is the dock, we can be rowing and rowing on the ocean of spirituality, but you know how far we're going to get? And that's the challenge to us, that somehow each of us must find comfort in not being tied to the dock. We can do that through meditation, through intention, by reminding ourselves that this is a movie. One way or another, the more we can free ourselves from here, the easier it will be for us to experience the joy of unity with the divine. And in our walk with the divine, this is what's required. That's not to say that we should not also be getting the advantage, the joy of being in this movie, in this reality. I'm not suggesting that we all become hermetic monks who live on a diet of porridge and sleep on rocks. The divine has given us this place for our growth, by my understanding. It's how are we going to use it, and how are we going to not lose our connection with the whole of being. Phyllis was reading this morning from the AA book, Thought for the Day, and she shared a poem with me, and I thought, doggone, or a meditation. I thought, doggone, this is right in touch with what I'm working on. So I'm going to read this to you. This is the time for my spirit to touch the Spirit of God. I know that the feeling of the Spirit touch is more important than all the sensations of material things. I must seek a silence of spirit touching with God. Just a moment's contact, and all the fever of life leaves me. Then I am well, whole, calm, and able to rise and minister to others. God's touch is a potent healer. I must feel that touch and sense God's presence. So that's the perspective. Don't negate here. Do welcome every connection you can gain with all the other facets of the spiritual existence. In Lift, we often have a client choosing or needing to shed commitments from past times, past universes, past existences. All of us have connections with past times, past universes, past existences. To remind you, so often little children, 4, 5, 6, end up, if you're listening, talking about something that clearly was a past life, because they don't have the fraught barriers we erect in this life, that comes later, that shut us off from our awareness of who we have been. One that I particularly remember was a young visitor. I was sitting at the same table she was, and she was playing with something. And suddenly she starts talking about the time when she was big, and she had to work hard, and her hands got burnt, and she couldn't work, and she got very hungry because they wouldn't let her work because her hands were burnt. This from a 5-year-old. Not that we need to remember all our past existences, but we do need to allow healing into all of them and new connections with the divine, with the Spirit, that can help us move forward in this life to rise, to minister to others, to feel whole, to feel happy, to feel welcomed, to feel accepted here and in the great reality beyond these three-dimensional limits. Which leads us back to the original poem. Think of it now, not in terms of life and death here, but our attachment to this life and to the rest of the world, the real universe. see, where is that? Here we are. No, that's not it. Here we are. So once again, you must be able to do three things. To love what is mortal, to hold it against your bones, knowing your own life depends on it. That's dealing with here. And when the time comes to let it go, to let it go. That does not necessarily mean death in the physical sense. Paul, as I recall, writes about being dead to the attractions of this world. I suggest that what we're talking about is the death of feeling we have to experience and hold on to this world tight, as opposed to riding it through, doing the best we can to love, to be loved, to share with others our experience of divine love, and our readiness to take the next step, whatever it is, to an ever closer relationship with the divine. Because that is our calling. That's the calling of every one of us. And we can choose to do it. We can choose not to. We have the freedom of choice.
With gratitude in our hearts for this time together, and gratitude for so many blessings that have been given. We want to put up into God's hands all the need for healing amongst every one of us, and for all of those that we know and are connected to that need healing. Especially this week, I want to pray for Charlotte and for Teresa. I ask that our hearts might learn how to trust, and that our connection with the divine might be strengthened each day, so that we can go forth and be our best selves and spread the love and the goodness that comes from God in however you may perceive him, and that we may let that light shine to the world that we are in. And I will have a special prayer for all the people in the Ukraine at this time. Pray that they might be strengthened in hope, in love, in peace, and in action. And I pray for the Russians, and that they may see the compassion in their hearts at this time. And I pray together with you in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.